Ray, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Ray Canzanese, Director of Threat Research at Netskope. And I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can come on and share yours. Thank you for joining us today. You're going to be talking about more about COVID in the cloud. We just had COVID and identity, so this is a great, an early afternoon review of all the things that get impacted by work from home. So take it away, Ray. All right, I'm not picking up your audio there again, Ray.
There we go. Can you hear me now,
There we
John?
go. Oh, it's awesome. Great.
Excellent. All right.
All right,
We are
take
in
it
good
away.
shape. Thanks, everybody, for joining. John, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here for my very first CornCon. I am going to take you through the COVID and the cloud story. I'm sitting on the Discord. So if you have any questions in real time that you want to shoot out my way, I'll see them and hopefully answer them in real time. This is very data driven, so I'll probably show you things that will evoke some questions like, what is that weird blip, right? What's actually going on there? I am the Director of Threat Research at Netskope. I am coming at you from Philadelphia. I did my PhD here at Drexel University, and I've been doing malware analysis, anti-tamper, cloud security, ML for about 15 years now. You've got my Twitter and my personal email address there if you want to find me outside of the context of this wonderful conference. So I want to start with a personal story of my pandemic experience. So it's going to be a familiar one, right? I was in Santa Clara, California, working at Netskope, which is a growing startup. You see a picture of me and hundreds of my closest friends standing in close proximity, not wearing masks, enjoying each other's company and getting some amazing work done. After the pandemic started, we all started working remotely, which means I am back in Philadelphia in my hometown, working from a bedroom converted office and, working with all of my colleagues via Zoom, via Slack, and drinking my homemade iced coffee out of a mason jar now. And so that's just a little personal touch to segue into the first bit of data, which is looking at Netskope's platform. So everything I'm going to present you is actual data from our platform. And the first thing we're looking at is just how remote were organizations before COVID hit and how remote are they now? And so this little chart looks at the past 12 months, and you see pre-COVID and post-COVID pretty clearly. There's a nice sigmoid there in the middle of the graph. Pre-COVID, you have people, about 25% of people working remotely. This measurement is actually the ratio of the number of publicly routable IPs that we see users coming from to the number of users, right? So the more remote people are, the more networks they're coming from, the higher this dispersion is going to be. This fun little sawtooth pattern, those are the ebbs and flows of the work week. Those spiky things are typically Friday, Monday. Those huge spikes, those are the holidays when more folks than usual are working remotely. And then we've got that big sigmoid. The interesting thing and why I wanted to share this picture is how quickly that happened, right? We went from 25% to 3/4 of everybody on our platform working remotely over the course of a few days. So this was a very sudden transition. And so this whole presentation is just going into more details about what that meant for security posture at companies and what that meant for attackers and what they were doing to go after those companies. We can break that down by industry. This is, we've had a bunch of speakers today from a bunch of different industries, right? Every industry is affected differently. And, for me, I'm in an IT industry, which is right in the middle of this graph. Pre-COVID, IT on average was about 40% remote. Afterwards, it's about 75% remote. And you can see there's industries that are less remote, like energy and healthcare, both before and after COVID, and industries that are much more remote and distributed, like real estate. And so that's why we've labeled COVID-19 as the leader in digital transformation. And what I want to talk now is, more details on what's actually going from a security standpoint with that digital transformation. And so that's the main topic, right? Security around COVID and security around the cloud. And so I'm going to talk about two distinct topics. First, I just want to talk about what is different in the enterprise. We saw changes in which apps people are using in the enterprise, particularly collaboration apps, unsurprisingly skyrocketed. We talked earlier today about personal devices being used for doing business, right? I'm going to talk about company devices, right? This laptop that I'm on that Netskope issued me being used for personal reasons, right? The converse, which also brings its unique risks, and just in general, an increase in risky behavior we've seen across the board. Then we'll pivot, and I want to talk a little bit about cyber criminals. Two things I'll highlight there is their efforts to capitalize on the crisis, which we all saw coming. And then some of the more interesting stuff that's happened ever since, at least I think it's more interesting. More of the evolution, right? More of how attackers are trying to evolve to get into enterprises, right? As enterprises also evolve to adapt. And depending on how much time, I might finish up with some of the response and predictions I have for the future. Some notes about the data analysis that I'm going to share. So Netskope sells a secure web gateway that we call a next-gen secure web gateway. We call it next-gen because it's both a secure web gateway and a CASB, which means that we see both the web traffic and the cloud app traffic. And we do a lot of work on the cloud app traffic to figure out what it is. So for example, I not only know that a user is in Google Drive, I know that they're editing a document, or I know that they're sharing a document with somebody, or I know that they're sending a message on Slack or downloading a file from Slack. So we have that level of like action granularity. All the data we're looking at in my team's anonymized. It's for a subset of the customers. So this isn't for all of Netskope customers, but just for the ones that gave us prior authorization to do this kind of research. So in total, it's about 1,000 organizations that the data I'm going to discuss covers. It's about 800,000 users, and the vast majority of them are in North America. And so we begin with COVID and the enterprise. I have lots of data, so I hope you love charts. I'm going to start with the collaboration apps. So this is just, if from a high level, right, the amount of activity we saw in collaboration apps over the past year. You see it's kind of on a gradual rise, right? It's kind of rising before COVID. COVID hits, huge rise, kind of still rising after COVID. And these rankings, excellent, high, medium, these are rankings that we do on the security posture of the apps themselves. And so what this shows is that the apps that people are using are generally ones we consider excellent or high in terms of security posture, meaning apps that are great to use for the enterprise, right? There's no problem with the app itself, right? There might be a problem with how you're using the app, but not with the app itself. There are some things that we call poor and low, and you do see in the pre-COVID days very little red in this graph, right? But then post-COVID, as people try to pick up, whatever apps they need to get their jobs done or to do whatever else they're doing with their computers, which we'll get into, maybe making some bad choices in terms of the apps that are being used. I'll take a step back because I just did something crazy, right? I showed you a graph with really no y-axis labels, and it just says activity. So I want to define what activity means and explain why I didn't put numbers on there. So activity, I'm going to use the same word to describe two things. If I'm talking about cloud apps, I'm talking about like the number of actions performed. So that'll be uploads, downloads, messages sent in Slack. So just the total number of interactions that we're seeing with that cloud app. And we normalize that by the total number of users on our platform. On the website side, it's number of visits to a website also divided by the number of users. So the idea here is that it's normalized by number of users. That's why I'm not showing the numbers, because the numbers would be weird, right? They're very small numbers. Going back to the collaboration apps, this is looking pretty much at that same graph, right? If you look at this graph and you look at this graph now, almost the same shape. And all I did was keep 3 apps and throw the rest of them away. I kept SharePoint, Slack, and Microsoft Teams. And so these are 3 of the most popular apps, but also tell an interesting story, right? SharePoint, completely unaffected, right? If an org adopted SharePoint, users were using it before, users were using it after, no change. Slack, on the other hand, right? Definitely used in enterprises before, but COVID-19 hits, nobody's in the office, right? Everybody's talking to each other on Slack. And then maybe, Microsoft comes in and says, hey, I need some of that business. Let's get those salespeople out there selling Teams. They're already using SharePoint, right? Let's get more people on Teams. And so you see Teams sort of growing in popularity over time while Slack decreases in popularity a little bit. So the distribution of the apps is balancing out, but that level has stayed about the same. We were at that same activity level, and that activity level is about twice as much activity per user than we saw pre-COVID. So let's look at web usage, right? That was about apps, and again, collaboration apps are the ones we saw the most increase. So on the web usage side, I just picked some categories of websites that people are visiting, and I picked the ones that are personal websites, right? Things that people are most likely not visiting because of work, but visiting because they're trying to unwind. Right. And the biggest one here is the streaming and downloadable video, right? People going to use services like Netflix. People were doing it all along, right? YouTube, Netflix, all those services. But then after COVID hit, we saw that at least double, right, on a per user basis. And we saw all these other categories go, right? Consumer shopping websites, right? We're probably all shopping more online than we ever have in our lives, right? And that shows in the data here as well. But I want to double click on other, because you see that band of other up top, and there's some interesting thing there, right? Things were getting personal, but at some level we started looking and we said, maybe things are getting a little too personal for activities on your work computers. And so this is just looking at maybe some of the stuff that's going to generally be an acceptable use policy violation, or things maybe you don't normally see happening on people's work laptops. Two of the noteworthy categories where we see huge jumps here, right? Adult content, other, and pornography, huge jumps, right? We're looking at probably like 6, 7x as much traffic, again, on managed corporate devices going to adult websites. But we're seeing other things as well, right? Piracy websites, peer-to-peer websites, drugs, all sorts of websites that we've as an InfoSec community always said these websites are known for hosting risky stuff. For example, just in the past 2 weeks, there was a adult ad network that was compromised and was hosting an exploit kit. That kind of stuff happens more frequently there than it does maybe on the rest of the internet. But sometimes the risks aren't always where you think or what you think they are. If I look at our data on our platform from the past year, the number of malware downloads, the number of risks that we blocked on users trying to go to adult websites is not very big, right? On the other hand, personal websites and blogs is the category of website where people are clicking on and trying to download the most malicious content, more than any other category of website. And so, we're seeing lots of personal web browsing increase. The amount of increase in personal websites and blogs was about twice as much browsing per user as we saw before the pandemic. Right. And so this translates to increased risk, right? There's an increased risk that they're going to go to one of these WordPress blogs that's compromised, that's hosting a COVID-19 scam or an Emotet downloader or something else malicious. So it's not always the obvious, right? Sometimes it's the stuff that seems more uninteresting where you're going to end up exposing yourself to the most risky content. And then my last point here, just before we switch and talk about what's happening in the cybercrime arena, is that sometimes you can blame all of this bad stuff on your kids, right? It's always nice to say, well, it's not my fault, it's my kid's fault. And we've got a chart to show that that's happening as well, right? This is education apps. And I don't have a breakdown, but this is like 90% Google Classroom. And this is the change in the amount of activity we saw in the education apps before and after COVID. And I cut this graph off just at the beginning of September. But you see two things, right? Once COVID hits, we go to homeschooling, end of the school year, lots of activity on Google Classroom, down a bit in the summer, and then this spike, I mean, I cut the graph off, but it just keeps going, right? We're at like 6x the pre-COVID amount of education apps being used in the house. And looking at the activity, right, it's not the parents checking in on their students, right? It's the students actually doing their schoolwork, right? So this points to not only, did the devices start getting used for personal reasons, but those work devices are also being handed to the kids and saying, here, use my laptop, do your homework. So a whole nother realm of risk, right? Because your children in K through 12, might not be as security savvy as you are, and certainly didn't go through all of your cybersecurity training that your employer made you go through. So 3 points from my COVID and the enterprise section: huge increase in collaboration apps, big increase in personal app usage and risky app usage. Risky in the classical sense, like people are going to adult websites that are known to host some malicious content, but also because the types of personal websites they're going to are also exposing them to more malicious content. And then we're seeing managed corporate devices getting shared with other people within the household. All right, so now we switch gears and we talk about these cyber criminals. So first is just the notion that if there's a global pandemic, cyber criminals are of course going to capitalize it, right? They capitalize on everything, right? When the Oscar nominees get released every year, we see people clicking on phishing links that use the Oscar nominees, right, as bait for people to enter their passwords for O365, right? So of course, if there's something of major global importance, they're going to try to capitalize on it. What this is graphing is the number of times that we blocked somebody from going to a malicious web page that contained something COVID-19 pandemic related. And so what's interesting here, right, is that we see these little blips, right? The pandemic started around the end of 2019. So we see some blips of attackers trying to get into enterprises. We see it happen early 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic declaration from the WHO happens. We don't really see much a change. And then we get into like April, May, June, and things just skyrocket from where they were before. And this is about a solid month and a half, 2 months of people clicking on things, right? Again, when I'm plotting the data here, right, this isn't like we saw more COVID-related websites in the wild. No, this is that we saw users actually clicking on the links and actually trying to go to this content, and we intercepted it and blocked them from getting there. So in other words, what happened, the attackers knew they had to capitalize on it because you saw them start back at the end of 2019, but it took them a while to get it right, meaning to get the baits, to get the tactics and techniques down to something that people would actually start clicking on and going to. Eventually organizations catch up, right? People become more aware of what's going on. Attacks get shut down. So it didn't last forever, but we still have this base that's been pretty consistent now for the past 4 or 5 months of this COVID-related scams, phishing lures, Trojans getting spread to enterprise users on our platform. The other big change that we saw is I think a little bit more interesting because it's less obvious. And when we looked at this data at first, we said, wow, we knew that we were seeing more malicious documents, but were we seeing that many more malicious documents? So what I'm plotting here is of the malware downloads that we prevent, what are the types of files that we're blocking pre and post COVID? And so what you see is that there's this first bar, Office documents. This is Microsoft Office documents, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints, Word documents, where we saw, not like, oh, twice as many as we saw before or 3 times as many. No, I mean, it's about 8x where we were in pre-COVID levels, just in terms of the number of malicious Office documents that users on our platform are actually clicking on and trying to download. And what's going on here is mostly Emotet's fault. So Emotet, when it recently became active again, is using Microsoft Office documents, heavily obfuscated, and doing a pretty decent job of evading signature-based AV with that obfuscation. They're using interesting techniques to share the initial bait emails. They're using compromised accounts and replying to actual threads from real people with the phishing baits to try to entice people to click on them. And so the two of those things combined, plus the fact that they're also overwhelmingly putting those payloads, those documents to download, in places that they know enterprise users are used to clicking. The two apps that we've seen most abused here for these Microsoft Office docs have been Office 365 and Box. We've also seen quite a few on Dropbox and Google Drive, right? The cyber criminals know that enterprise users use Microsoft Office document formats. They've figured out a way to evade signature-based detection with some of their new obfuscation techniques, and they figured out a way to deliver it. And so this is, recognition that people might be in places where there's fewer security controls, advanced security controls that can block this kind of stuff. And also they're just more inclined to click on a Office 365 link that comes in from an email from a real email attachment. So my two takeaways here, right? Attackers, cyber criminals are going to always capitalize on a crisis. They are always trying to evolve with the enterprise, right? If they see cloud adoption, they're going to switch and start adopting cloud apps as well because they know people are used to using them. Just for comparison, I said that we're seeing a lot of these malicious Office documents spread through cloud apps. I think it's around 90% of them now that are coming in through cloud apps. Compared to baseline pre-COVID, we saw maybe 40% tops on a particularly bad month of cloud delivered malware. And so I do have a prediction here. This onslaught of Office cloud apps, it's still happening. It started in late July, and it really hasn't slowed down. And I do expect this is going to continue for quite a while. And so I'll change gears once more and talk a little bit about how companies have responded to this shift, both in security posture and in attacker techniques. And so first I'll start with just the general security checklist, right? Given what I'm sharing here today, right? What is it that organizations that we deal with, what are the conversations we're having with them? What are they thinking about, and what are they doing in response? The first is, if your business over the course of a few days onboarded tens of thousands of new users onto a cloud app, or certain BUs started using new cloud apps that were never used before. What are those cloud apps? Do you know what they are? Do you have appropriate monitoring in place? And do you have appropriate security controls around those apps? Things like, if you just started using Office 365, are you preventing users from just generating public share links for all of their documents? Are you controlling who they can share with? Are you controlling what outside organizations can share documents with people inside your organization? The questions are always app specific, because every one of these apps has a different set of controls, and you want to make sure that you're not exposing your data to data leaks, especially ones that are your fault because one of your users misconfigured something, or to attacks and breaches, right? Somebody gets into your organization because they managed to get into somebody's Google Drive account, and the Google Drive account had VPN set up details in it with passwords. Number two is, all these laptops that are now in the home being used for your kids to do their homework, being used for you to watch Netflix, and also being used for work. Are they protected? And are they protected against the things we're seeing, right? The cloud delivered malware, the web delivered malware, the different types of malicious websites, the new phishing scams that we've been seeing, especially the COVID related ones. Are they doing a good job against Office documents, right? Is whatever solution you have in there, was it maybe laser focused on PE files and doesn't do as well with Office documents? And now you've got this blind spot for Trojan delivery. Just taking a look at that and making sure the right controls are in place. And then finally, there's a lot of gray area here, right? I use terms risky when we were talking about people going to certain categories of websites. So how do you handle that? How do you handle if somebody goes to a website and it's a risky website? Do you block them? Because if you block them, maybe they're just going to start doing all of their work on their personal laptop where you have no visibility and control. What if they're making other choices that are questionable? What can you possibly do about that? And so I want to talk a little bit more about the gray area, because we've had some really interesting conversations with a few of our customers post-COVID about how they're handling the gray area. And they're handling it with a strategy that we call coaching. And this is a feature we have where you can choose not to block something, but to give the user a pop-up and say, are you sure you want to do that? And so basically, if there's something in that gray area, some of our customers have set up these coaching policies. And what we found in their usage pattern is that the coaching policies are working. 90% of the time, the user says, oh yeah, you're right. I do not want to do that, right? I am going to decide that that was a bad idea and I shouldn't do it that way. And so just some examples of the things we're coaching about. One of them is, in terms of app usage, when you've got a modern enterprise where everybody's using whatever cloud apps they want, I'm presenting you this presentation from my official Netskope Google Drive account. And in that same browser, I'm logged into 4 different Google Drive accounts that are all personal, right? And so if somebody tries uploading financial information to Google Drive, a few of our customers have put these policies in place that just give them a coaching message. Hey, you're trying to upload a doc. It's your personal Google Drive. Are you sure you wanted to do this? I think you might not want to because it's company proprietary information, right? And it's up to them to decide yes or no whether they continue. We see the same in the medical industry. A lot of our healthcare customers put controls in around HIPAA controlled data or HIPAA covered data, right? I don't want people sharing medical records with other folks on Slack, right? There are specific places that medical records could be. So remind the users if they're uploading something that looks like a medical record somewhere, are you sure you want to do this? And then we can do the same for security threats as well, right? It's not always malicious and benign, right? There's a lot of gray area. And so what do you do with something like you decide that something is probably a scam website based on some heuristics? Let them know and let them decide whether they want to go there. And so I just want to leave you with 3 takeaways. Working from home, risky business, right? We saw just tons of risky behavior from our customers, users, once they switch to working from home. And I predict that a lot of these changes are going to be permanent. A lot of those apps that organizations or business units have chosen to adopt aren't going to go away when everybody goes back to the office, right? So we really do need to look at all of them, figure out what they are, and make sure we have appropriate security controls on top of them. And a lot of these behaviors are probably going to be permanent as well. Maybe work from home is more acceptable now because organizations can handle it better. Maybe you'll see people working from home once or twice a week. And so these things, this risky behavior you see in the home, you're probably still going to continue to see once or twice a week. And so you still need to deal with that increase in risky behavior. Number 2 is that the cyber criminals never waste a good crisis, right? COVID happened, they were there. It took them a while to get it right, but they finally started getting lots of Trojans and phishing emails and other things through to enterprise users where they started clicking. the other piece here was that pivot to, especially with Emotet, use malicious documents and deliver them through cloud apps. That, because of how persistent it's been and how successful it's been, I'm expecting we see a lot more of that. And it's not just cloud apps, it's going to be other types of files as well, delivered through all sorts of cloud apps. And then finally is this idea that when you're in this area, this gray area where you want your customers, your users to use you want them to use their laptop, the company controlled laptop. You want them to be on the one where you monitor it. You can react if something goes bad. So you have to provide them some flexibility or they just go elsewhere. And so we expect that this coaching strategy is going to increase in popularity. Block the known bad, but help out with the questionable, with the gray area, so that you don't drive your users away. And so with that, I left you with my Twitter handle, my personal email address if you want to reach out to me there, and a link to my blog, my team's blog on our website. Ahead of this conference presentation, we published a few blogs that go into a little bit more detail on the stuff that I talked about here today. So if you want to learn more, you can head over there.
All right,
so
Ray,
I guess with that, I'm gonna see if there's any questions that we
yeah,
have from the audience.
I don't see any yet. Please post your questions in the Q&A or the chat. I'll go over and check out Discord. I'm not seeing anything new there. Ray, you're welcome to head over to our Discord. Anyone can register for our Discord by going to corncon.net, and there's a link there that will invite you to our server. We have a lot of content there. We have contests, and there can have discussion about what you hear in the track. So thanks again, Ray, for coming. And this is all very topical and very interesting. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks, John, for inviting me, and thanks to everybody here at CornCon for participating. I will definitely be continue to be over there in the Discord, and you have other ways to get into contact with me if you're interested in following up.
We have one question. It usually happens this way. As soon as we finish, we have a question. Any threat from Google Docs, Google Sheets?
Oh yeah, of course. So I mean, if you were to ask that question about any cloud app, I would be able to answer in the affirmative, right? If it's a cloud app that's popular in the enterprise, we see attackers abuse it. I mentioned that Office 365 and Box were the two top ones we've seen so far, but we see an awful lot of content coming in through Google Drive, Google Docs as well.
All right. Thanks again for your time today, Ray. It was a great presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the conference.